Good evening. Hello, Andy. Thank you for coming up and agreeing to help me. I'm going to start by sharing with you an illusion. And the easiest way I found to explain it is that it's kind of like looking at a photograph or a bit of film. And the reason is that these things are designed to be visually deceptive. They're meant to be misleading. And they can even be false. And we're going to try and create one of these illusions. And I actually have a camera with me. Well, it's more metaphorical than it is physical, Andy. But it does have several features in common. Firstly, it has its own little case. Secondly, it has a shutter. And thirdly, it even has a flash. Yeah, and you guys thought I was just joking, right? In fact, Andy, could you hold on to the lighter for me, please? In a moment, I'll get you to light that up. Because along with the lighter, we're also going to use a little bit of paper. Now, this is some of the paper they used to use in old black and white photography. I love giving the lighter to a man. You see him hold it nice and close. It's like, ooh, fire. Give it to a woman, you see her hold it at arm's length. But if you could light that up for me, Andy. Perfect. You see, if I take the paper and touch it to the flame, we actually create the illusion of a coin. Now, it looks real, it feels real, and if you listen, it even sounds real. But it's just an illusion. In fact, because it's a coin, it means it's the illusion of wealth. But because of that, I can take the coin and place it back into the flame. Now, I know you may not have been able to see that, so I'll bring it back. Similarly, with a little bit of heat, the image seems to just melt away. Now, I'll try and bring it back for you as slowly as I can, and different people start to see the coin appear at different times. But slowly, you should start to see it. Now, you'll remember at the beginning I said the easiest way to think of it is that it's kind of like looking at a photograph or a bit of film. The reason I chose that analogy is because if you were to imagine watching as someone took a coin and dropped it from hand to hand, but not just watching that action, actively recording it, and then watching that recording in reverse, you'd almost swear you'd seen that coin fall up. In fact, could you hold the light for me, please, Andy? You see, others find it easier to think of it more as like an illusion or a mirage, where it's sort of hard to make out the details. For instance, was the coin in the hand? Or did you just imagine it? Now I'll bring it back. Now I know it's a little bit confusing with both the lighter and the coin. So get rid of the lighter and just use the coin. But as I said, it's a bit confusing. Was the lighter in the pocket? Was the coin? Or did you just imagine it? But if you did imagine it, you could imagine me making a fist. And you could imagine the coin inside the fist. Of course, it would depend how good your imagination was as to whether we could make it real. I love you guys look like you're just giving up. But when you think back to this, because you will, you may start to question what you saw. You may start to question what you thought you knew. Was the coin real? Was the lighter real? Or was what you saw nothing more than an illusion of something that never was? Thank you. Thank you, Andy. In fact, Andy, could I ask you to put on this glove for me, please? If you'd hold your hand out about at that height as well. Because believe it or not, that's going to represent the underworld. And along with that, we're also going to be using the lighter. Perfect. Okay. Now, the ancient Greeks believed that lives were represented by a single strand of thread. And these threads were at the mercy of the Mirae, 3 cloaked figures of destiny, 3 goddesses of fate. The first, Clotho, spun the thread, thus giving birth to a life. The second, Lachesis, measured the thread and determined each person's allotted time on the earth. And the third, Atropos, decided the manner of each death and broke the thread. Now, there are many famous Greeks woven into history. Icarus, for example, sought to fashion wings of feather and wax and flee the Minotaur. But Icarus was young and arrogant. He ignored his father's advice and flew too close to the sun. The wax melted, and Icarus fell. Perfect. Achilles was a mighty warrior. Immersed in the river Styx at birth, he became immortal, all but for where he was held. In the Battle of Troy, a poison arrow struck his ankle, and so too Achilles' thread was cut. Now, Orpheus was said to have been given the gift of music by the gods, melodies which could enchant people, rocks, even birds. But when Orpheus was ambushed by bandits, the sound of horns and drums drowned out his melodies, and soon the rocks turned red with blood. Now, King Midas was given a gift by the gods, a wish of his choosing, but Midas chose poorly. He wished for all he touched to turn to gold. And at first he was joyous, as rock, roots, even water turned pale yellow at his touch. But soon his gift became a curse, as food and wine too turned to gold as it touched his lips. Driven mad with hunger and hatred at his curse, so the moray broke another thread. Now Sisyphus was said to be the only man who ever journeyed to the underworld and returned, and in the process tricked Hades. But the moray were angered by this, and they not only broke his thread, but also sentenced him to an eternity of punishment. And so, one by one, these heroes' threads were cut, and they moved from this world into the underworld. Now, there were some that believed it was possible to journey back to the underworld and actually restore the broken threads, but none whom tried ever returned. And while these people that I've told you about were said to have lived over 3,000 years ago, and none of them ever returned. And it is in their stories they have become immortalized. Thank you. Okay, we'll try something a little bit different. I'm going to be using your help. In fact, you can take the glove off if you'd like, Andy. It's probably getting a bit warm. Now, my great-grandfather served in the First World War, a second lieutenant. He was young and naive. As a matter of fact, he'd lied about his age to be there in the first place. He used to play cards, and he liked to drink. Now, you'd forgive us for thinking it was the war that had driven him to the bottle. But no, he always maintained it was the cards. And it took us many years before he ever told us why. What I'm going to try and do is recreate the final game of cards that my great-grandfather George ever played. But before I go further, could you call out stop for me whenever you'd like, Andy? Are you sure? It is up to you. You had to think. What I'm going to get you to do is if you could write your name across the four of diamonds. Because there's a little known fact, more so in the forces, that the four of diamonds is known as the card of lead. Reason being, soldiers believed when they were dealt that card, it meant that there was a bullet with their name written on it. In fact, I'll take the pen back and also the card. Because you see, it wasn't just any cards that drove George to drink. It was the four of diamonds in particular. Fortunately, he always carried with him a shot. And in his flask, one final shot of whiskey. Don't suppose you like whiskey by any chance, do you, Andy? Not too bad. Well, George didn't much either, but he did find practice helps. So what I'm going to ask you to do is if you could cast your minds back 100 years, imagine yourselves in the trenches in the Somme. Imagine 4 players sitting down to play a game of cards. It's early evening, and would you believe it just so happened to be George's turn to deal? Now, you can imagine he wasn't best pleased to see the 4 of diamonds. And in fact, when the other players weren't looking, he tried to sneak the card out of the game and steal for himself an ace. And so the game continued. I'll be honest, he was kind of glaring at his pocket a little bit like you were, Andy. And so I think you're starting to understand why it was that George said that it was the cards that had driven him to drink. Fortunately, he always had one final shot. You can try some if you'd like, Andy. That's true, it is a little bit early. Having said that, you're looking like you might want one. All it took was a shell, and George took the opportunity to hide the card. Now, at this point, I think you'd understand George starting to feel a little bit paranoid. And in fact, before he dealt himself the third card, he stole a glance. Now, maybe it was light, maybe it was just dirt. But for a moment, George could have sworn he'd seen the 4 of diamonds. And in fact, oh, thank you. But in fact, in his angst, he demanded to see the rest of the cards. But the deck was fine, and George had to question whether he could even believe what he was seeing. Oh, 2 people. But I think the other players were starting to get a little bit suspicious, and they actually demanded that he dealt with one hand placed fairly behind his back. You look slightly worried for me, Andy, to be honest. Now, you'd imagine George would be relieved at the sight of the Jack of Spades, but to be honest, it did very little to calm his nerves. And I'll show you why. You see, that right was reserved for the whiskey alone. Fortunately, he always had one final shot of whiskey with him. And so, as the game came to a close and the final cards were dealt, George actually stumbled from the dugout and into the cold, wintry night. And he may have won the hand. And as I said at the beginning, what I was going to try and do was recreate the final game of cards George ever played. And it wasn't until many years later, when we were going through some of his things, that we came across a letter that he sent back home. I've actually brought it with me to read for you. My dearest Annette, I'm not sure when you will receive this, but events have happened that will stay with me for years to come. Even as I write this, I can scarcely believe what happened. A shell destroyed a bunker I was in but moments before. I had only just left the card game. My hand was tormented by a single card, the 4 of diamonds. As I left, and I could have sworn that I saw in the snow and ice that card immortalised. As I said at the beginning, I was going to try and recreate this final game of hands that George ever played. Actually, with me, I have some ice. And while you can just about see a card sealed inside, ladies and gentlemen, your son.
Douglas Tilston.
Thank you very much. Thank you for helping me.
In 3rd place, Douglas Tilston.